Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fires and Grading Show. I'm Becky Pepler and joined by my amazing partners, Don Smith and Garth Larson, here to talk all things assessment and grading. I know it's been an incredibly energizing few weeks hearing from so many educators. I know we've all been in quite a few schools and working with a lot of teachers and staff around the United States, tackling grading reform head on. And this episode today builds right into that momentum. So Garth and Don, just starting out, how are you both doing today?
I'm doing well. We have a kind of a foggy morning where I am. It's kind of fun, but I love it because it reminds me of being out on the West Coast. Is kind of how I describe it. Of just at those beautiful mornings when the fog rolls in, but definitely excited to jump into our discussion today.
And I know how much you love that side of the United States, Don. So that was probably a real great thing for you to wake up to this morning.
Feels just like home for him, right? So fantastic here, Becky. Thanks. Really looking forward to this particular episode because, when we can take questions from the field, people that have, are working through this and really trying to figure out, with those struggles, how do we overcome some of those challenges? So I'm super excited to dive into some of the questions that have come in from our listeners regarding some of the scenarios that they're facing as they're working through, assessment and grading reform.
Yeah. And I'm super excited about this too. It is a little different. Typically we've spent our episodes talking about one topic in the entirety of the episode. But this one is questions from the field. So these are questions that maybe couldn't take an entire episode to be able to answer. So we thought we would start and probably do one of these episodes periodically, but just take some things that we've heard out working with schools and just jump into some of those questions. So we'll hit some of those today. As we always said before, if there are questions that you are dying to know the answer to, please feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to incorporate that into our shows along the way. We are always looking for ideas. So just that little plug there. But let's jump in. So the first question, and this one gets people talking a lot. Now, this is going to be geared a little bit probably more towards our secondary level schools, but I hear it almost every time I'm working with a secondary school and they're working on transforming or making a change into standards-based grading and reporting. And they're coming from a system that typically or used to have final exams at semester that were some sort of weight for them, 10% or 15% of that semester grade. And so the question comes up a lot, what happens with final exams or those like cumulative end of term assessments? What do those look like? Are they still there, not there when you shift to standards-based grading? So can either of you maybe shed a little bit of light on how you've seen that working or kind of that thought process?
Don, do you care if I chime in on this one? It's one that I'm pretty passionate about in terms of kind of rethinking. So Becky, I would encourage all of our listeners, if they're kind of struggling through this, because again, it's, as you said, it's a very, very common question that comes up when we're working with schools. And I think if I could go back and do it all over again, one question I think we have to start with is, what is the purpose for final exams in the first place? I think a lot of times it's been a placeholder because that's very much what we've seen in traditional models where you go through a semester, you've gathered all this information. We want to make sure that they cumulatively can retain all of that information that we've covered in a semester, and we need to test them on everything at the end. When in reality, I'm not really sure, A, that's best practice, or B, that it really kind of aligns with what we're aiming to do, which is ensure that our students, yes, we want to make sure they keep those skills, keep that knowledge throughout. But if we're doing a really good job throughout the course of the semester, making sure that when we've established that a student is proficient, well, then I don't think they need to prove it to us a third or fourth, a seventh time through this kind of high stakes cumulative test at the end of a semester. So I would always say, like, first and foremost, like, what is our reason for that? Now, there is potentially a very good reason that school districts still choose, or high schools still to choose to keep that final at the end. But then I think the second question is, how can we then ensure that the way we approach it still aligns with our purpose for grading? So there's the purpose for the semester exams, but more importantly, let's talk about this final week that we have. And how does that make it still align with policy, practice, procedure, et cetera, for why we're grading in the first place? And I'll give one example, and I'm sure, Don, you have a lot of different examples you can jump in with. One example that I've seen that still aligns very well with the purpose is, and I'm going to kind of look at this through a lens of maybe like a semester one final. So we're approaching the midpoint of the year, and it was very common for us to still have some element of a final exam, even after we had transitioned fully into our standards-based model. But the look was a little bit different. So some of our departments said, you know what, there are a few targets or standards that are so critically important that I need to make sure that you still have that depth of understanding, because it is a prerequisite to what the second semester is going to look like. I'm going to assess you again on this one and maybe pick a couple of targets. There's others that I've seen where the students, it's kind of their last chance to demonstrate proficiency at the end of that semester. So maybe some students have been going through the full semester and there's a, 2 or 3 or 4 targets that they're not yet proficient on. It kind of serves almost as a reassessment on those standards or targets for the students, where it's kind of that last opportunity to demonstrate that. And then I've seen a combination of both, where sometimes the teachers will say, you know what, we're going to select these 2 or 3 standards that I want to make sure I assess on this end of semester exam or final, however you want to reference it. But then we're going to have you pick a couple too, and we're going to be prepared to be able to offer that as well. So it's a little bit choice driven. I would say the more that we can get toward it's kind of an opportunity to be able to retain and showcase some of those key essential learning targets that we have within a semester. Well, then I think it's still a potentially really good use of the time. So those are some things that I've seen, but I always say start with let's build a vision for what we really want to accomplish from that finals week, and then start to say what are some what are some practices we can use to be able to stay aligned with that. Don, what are you seeing out there with how some schools are handling it?
I actually kind of want to jump back to first the purpose part, because I think the number one response we typically hear is we have to give a final exam because that's what the colleges are doing. And I just really think that we need to revisit, if that is our purpose, if that is the sole driver of doing it is because colleges are doing it, I think we need to just take a step back and think about which of our standards have that wording in it, which, because the colleges are doing it, that's why we have to do it. But also, and I think I'm going to speak for myself. Let me ask you guys, as I look at you, we've all been through a lot of grad classes. Did every single one of your, whether it's undergrad or graduate classes, did every one of them have a final exam? Like, and they, yeah, because I'm like, I think I had it in about 20% of my college courses as I worked through at an actual final exam.
And I would say probably more in like the electives early on, but then once you got more into your majors, it was really much more driven through, have you accomplished the skills that you need that are focused on within that class.
Yeah, so like I'd say, if your purpose is because we're preparing them for college, have an actual deep discussion about that, because are we really, and once again, which college, which professor, I always kind of go down that rabbit hole. But the second thing is, I really do, like, I think we, too often in schools, one of the big reasons why we're working on this journey, right, of standards-based learning and teaching practices is that we want to ensure that we get as many kids to mastery as we can. But I don't think, like, I love the idea of having another chance to assess to see if we're still there. But I think the final exam's like too late for that. It's like then it kind of comes into more of a gotcha moment of ensuring. And I love the idea, Garth, we talk about, does it align with your current thinking? And like I say, if we're waiting for that final exam to get that one last chance to see if they still know it, like, we're kind of at that spot of, I don't know, can we still reteach then? Can we reassess? And I mean, I think it's just, it becomes more of a gotcha versus can we use that last time for even more teaching and learning? Like, I think every day is so precious in education that I just feel like there's better uses of that time that we could be doing versus just this structured. And I think of like finals days and how it looks in so many different places. It's kind of like the wild, wild west. Kids are sleeping in, kids are here, kids are there, depending on how the schools do it. Like, there's got to be better ways. When we say we don't have time, is there a better use we could use that time? So Garth, it's more of what I've seen aligns what you've said.
Yeah. And so just on, as you're even talking about the time and the student component, and then I'm going to throw the question back at you, Becky, because you lived through some of those different changes and different experiences of what finals week has looked like in the classroom through that transition. But I remember we ran a couple kind of small focus groups pre-making any changes to finals week within the high school. And one thing that it still just really sticks out to me is, even from our students that I would probably categorize as some of our highest performing students that, were excelling in the classroom, also outside the classroom in a lot of areas, and hearing their anxiety about finals week and how much pressure it was putting on them, even though they've been able to show that they're doing exactly what they need to do throughout the semester. It just kind of hit me quite a bit to say, like, kind of back to your point, like, what are we doing? Like, why do we believe this is good practice? When you kind of hear what that student experience is, where we're gonna, have X number of finals on this day that are 2.5 hours in length each, and it's going to cover everything that's been taught in a semester. Like, what are we doing?
Because we're preparing them for the real world, Garth. That's what we're doing. That's what we hear, right? That's what you hear. So
So I don't know. I think just it was very helpful for me also to reframe my thinking a little bit, just kind of hearing what the student experience was in that kind of traditional finals week model. But Becky, what were some of the ways that you both saw it successful from your lens of your classroom, kind of maybe rethinking and reshaping a little bit what finals week looked like? And then even, the numerous schools that you worked with, what are some examples you've seen that seem to work well within kind of the thinking behind what we're trying to accomplish with assessment and grading?
Yeah, as a teacher, we still had finals, like that didn't go away, but we had to rethink. So really echoing what you guys both had mentioned there too. The example that you shared a little bit earlier, Garth, is exactly what I did in my own classroom. There was a certain number of targets that we just wanted to make sure we spiraled them throughout the year. So we were just making sure that they still had that level of knowledge and understanding, because we were going to go ahead and use those in that next semester. So it really looked exactly like what you were just saying. I think what I've noticed in schools is that we've really just had to rethink it, right? We've had to think differently, and we had to come to a common agreement that just because it's the way that we've always done it doesn't mean it's the way we need to keep doing it. So really getting grounded back at what is your purpose, what is your why. Don, I loved the point that you said too about, like, we keep saying we don't have time, but if you really uncover the amount of time that's dedicated towards that final exam schedule, towards the preparation days for that final exam schedule, I can guarantee that a majority of teachers would get a full week back of instruction, if not more, if that time was restructured differently. And so I think it's just like we can't completely stay rooted in tradition when we talk about grading reform and we talk about change. We have to think differently and always go back to that purpose and that why. And I think that's what gets us out of these ruts that we get caught into, but they're really ruts of tradition. But that tradition isn't necessarily in alignment with promoting or improving student learning, which is ultimately what our goal is in anything that we do. So I know there's probably a little bit more we could dig into there, but I want to make sure that we get into a couple other questions in our conversation today too. So this one I heard actually more recently, and this comes from a teacher who has another teacher who teaches in their same content area team, grade level team. And they had kind of pulled me aside actually separately and said, what am I supposed to do? Like, what if I'm all in, but my teaching partner isn't? Like, how am I supposed to keep this momentum going without creating, tension within our team, knowing that we're continuing to move forward with this work? And so it was putting this teacher in just kind of a hard situation because they know they were doing the right thing and going in the right direction, that the district was moving forward, but someone else is kind of chirping in their other ear when administration is not around, right? When someone else, like, so do you guys have any, just some quick tips for how to kind of keep that momentum going, and reducing maybe that tension for teachers who maybe are experiencing that same situation?
I just like, Becky, how you just said there about reducing the tension, because I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we think the tension's going to go away.
Correct.
Like,
It's not going away.
right? Like, the tension is there. But when it's your peer, you don't, like, your job isn't to evaluate or force or push, right? That's where we have our administration to come in and support you. Your goal is to keep doing what you believe is the right work as you've kind of been moving along. So I think, I'm not sure if there's a way to get rid of it for sure, but it's about trying to reduce that, in my opinion, because the tension's there, but the tension isn't meant to be between you and your colleague. It's meant to be as you're working through it, but that colleague can have tension with their administration if they'd like. You know what I mean? I think that's one thing I try to help them remind them of it. But I'd say it's to me, as you're working through it and you know what the work is, keep doing, because as you start to see results, and I think about, if we think back to the sources of efficacy, one of them being vicarious experiences, and maybe your partner needs to see you have success. Okay. And what are examples of micro moments of success that you could have, that when your partner is ready to see those, that they can then see them, and your partner can say, tell me more about that, right? Without you forcing it on them. But it's like, how can you begin to have those I think, micro moments where they can then see, oh, so you were able to do that. Your kids did do their homework, even though it potentially wasn't graded. Like, I think I start to think about, like, you want to show those little moments without forcing it upon them, because your job is not to force as a teaching partner, in my opinion. You're not their supervisor there. So
Yeah, and I think that's a great reminder, Don, too, because sometimes I think teachers carry that load. And, I always say, like, as educators, like like we always want to do the right thing, and we know when we're hearing. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, Don, it's kind of like, don't let that deter your work if you know that you're moving in the right direction. So continue to move that, right? But then also be able to share, like, and again, without force, but be able to share, like, hey, I tried this in my classroom and guess what I saw as a result of that, right? And if you keep sharing those little bits of information, that could be, like someone else might go, I would love that too. Like, I want that in my classroom. What did you do? And then maybe it just kind of naturally opens the door, but just might cause a little bit of tension, for a period of time. Hopefully that will reduce itself by sharing those, those micro moments, those vicarious experiences that you were talking about.
Well, and I'm gonna kind of reach out to leadership a little bit on this part as an extension of that conversation. I think it's hard for teachers sometimes to just openly share that information, especially if there is a little bit of tension there, because they also don't want to add a layer of tension by saying, oh, great, you're coming and you're showing me all this, knowing that I'm not necessarily on board. But, another element that we've, learned from Jenny and Don around collective teacher efficacy is the idea of embedded reflective practice. And so for leaders out there, if this is something that's moving forward, I would highly encourage you to create opportunities for embedded reflective practice around some of the strategies that the teachers are trying. So now it's not on the teacher to just willingly come up to her teaching or his teaching partner and say, here's what I tried and here's what I saw. Create structures that allow for that. Maybe it's in a faculty meeting. All right, everyone come and let's reflect on a strategy around this that you've worked. And I think, to Don's point, then they're at least seeing it through a couple different lenses, which maybe might help kind of lower that barrier, that resistance that they might be seeing. So I would say we have to, from a leadership lens, create those opportunities to share those experiences. I also would wonder, in that scenario where there's a little bit of tension, or the partner teacher is saying, I'm not buying into this. I would love to know, like, if that relationship is comfortable enough to say, well, help me understand more. So instead of, like, what is it that you're struggling with? Because even the teacher that's still maybe a little bit more on board with it or moving forward with it, they still might be having that same struggle, but that's the struggle that's really holding this person up. So I would also want to say, like, what is it that you're struggling with? Because maybe we can work through this together, And so instead of it just being this person saying, I'm on board, this saying person, I'm saying, no, we're like, all right, well, what are some of the challenges that we're facing? And maybe we can try to come up with some solutions together and kind of build on, what's leading to some of that resistance. I do always wonder when that tension exists. I'm guessing it's probably not just because we're making changes around standards-based grading. There's probably some additional layers there too of what's actually occurring within that partnership. So I think there's a couple things that kind of influence it. But leaders create opportunities for those shared experiences, which will then help others see what it looks like.
Garth, I was just kind of laughing as you said, ask them maybe what they're. I'm like, I think they already know, because I bet their partner's letting them know from the very beginning. I doubt they have to ask, what are you struggling with? Because I bet they.
Yeah, but I think there's some that are just saying, this isn't doable. We can't do this. So why? Or those that are, I'm like, I'm not investing in it because 3 years from now it's going to be gone and we're going to be focusing on something else. So I think there's a few things that kind of lead to some of that resistance as well.
I do love how you both kind of gave some teacher insight and some leadership insight to that, because it really is not just one dimensional, right? When we're really looking at how to kind of approach that particular situation. So thank you for that. This next question, it's a little bit specific, and I see it come up out in more areas, but this one was specifically asked from a physical education teacher. And it was coming from a place of, like, so much that what students do in their classroom, they were sharing with me, was based on participation and effort. Like, they show up, they dress for class, they do the activity for the day. And struggling with the idea of, like, well, if I'm changing to standards-based grading, how am I supposed to grade if, they're not participating in class? Or like, how do I change those structures? Knowing that a lot of those things now kind of fall under behaviors, right? Approaches to learning or those learner outcomes that we want for students. But our physical education standards themselves, right, don't say that you dress for class and that you just participate. Like they're specific to actual academic standards. So, any insight you guys have kind of around that conversation of how to best, and again, this was from a physical education teacher, but this is beyond that. Like, and sometimes in like more performance based classes, I've also heard it something very similar to that. Like, how am I supposed to grade now? I always just graded out. They got participation points every day.
Garth, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this one, Becky, because it is very common that we see. So I think the first thing we always have to start with is let's just go back and revisit the standards themselves. What are the standards actually asking of the students, and do we have clarity on what it means for that student to be successful within those standards through the targets we develop, the success indicators, et cetera. So I think often for our teachers, physical education teachers, I don't always know if that conversation has occurred enough for them to understand then how they can begin to separate some of those learner outcomes, how the students are approaching learning in there, because they're just accustomed to what they've always kind of done, right? So I think the first step is we have to have that clarity first. So then we can come back to a conversation and say, okay, great. We know that, let's just say the standard is a student can identify ways to perform or live a healthy lifestyle. Great. What does that mean? What does that look like? Now, we need them to showcase this and we need them to participate in class. So we need that in order to gather evidence of whether or not they can do it. But the act alone isn't what we're evaluating. It's, does the act lead to what we want to see them do in the classroom? And I would just say, I think that's something that we really need to focus on, is getting that clarity on the forefront, which I think then helps them understand, okay, great. I'm not grading effort, but I need them to participate, or I'm not grading, but I need them to participate in this scenario so I can gather evidence that I'm actually looking for within the standard. And now I see how this potentially fits as a learner behavior when it comes to the participation. That's on the physical education side of it.
So just to, like, you said something in there, Garth, that made me think a little bit too. Like, that mindset of, well, we need them to participate. In all honesty, don't we need kids to participate regardless of the content area to be able to collect evidence that we can actually measure?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We need them to engage in the participation is the way that we're getting evidence from them.
Correct. Yeah. So it's no different than walking into, my science classroom. Like, if they're not participating in what we are doing, I'm not able to gather the evidence of learning that's necessary. And I think sometimes that's just looked upon as like, well, it's different in physical education than it is in other courses. But if you really get down to that point, we need kids to participate in every single course, regardless of the content area, because if they don't, we aren't able to gather evidence of learning. And so that piece, sorry, just to add that in, Don, you had something to add?
Yeah, well, it connects to that. And this is where, like, Garth, I wanted you to go first. I wanted you to respond from the standard side. Okay. But I think if we go back to our previous episodes around accountability, because I think what's missing is, like when we go from school to school, district to district, there are certain teachers I think that we find that use this part as a way to hold kids accountable, to get them to do those things without thinking about, well, how do I do that in my natural, like in my environment, and get kids want to be there. I think of, like, teacher credibility, that effect size of 1.09. And it's like, do kids see you as a credible person to be a mentor, to guide them on their journey? Credibility has multiple parts of it, but how do you create the environment where kids want to do those things and want to be there with you and want to be in it? And I think we see so many different versions of educators in every content area, right? And every content area has folks that might struggle to get kids to participate, as we call it, and kids that don't. But I think it's the ones that still try to use the grade as the accountability piece, and that's all they've known. So I think they have to kind of think, how do they build relationships with kids? How do they get students engaged? Because we're always going to have, okay, and this is in every single classroom, potentially 5 to 10% of kids, because it's that day, something happened. They just don't, they're not going to lock in. They don't want to, right? That's just part of education, I feel like, with where we are. But when you hit a much higher percentage than that, it's not about the standard of the grade. It's about the environment of the space and what do we need to do. And I think we have to rethink how we do PE in that moment. If we're really hitting a high number, kids don't see the value in, I mean, because we always hear the dress down, right? And I always feel like, I don't know, dress down should be dress up. I don't know. But anyway, it's like this, I don't know what it is, but it's like that some folks are so fixated on that part. And obviously kids aren't seeing the value in it. So how do we help them see the value or create an environment where they want to change? Or I just create, to me, I get to the culture and climate of your PE environment. I think it's a much bigger question and one that we need to address. I think it's a much harder one to address because it's a very personal question, and it's trying not to insult anybody as we think through it. But
I've walked into physical education environments that are fully at the implementation stage of standards based, have a really good wrap around their standards. They're not using participation, or if they're dressing, to however is expected of them as a part of the grade. So all of those things have been removed that we tend to hold on to. And guess what? In those best environments where those teachers, as Don said, had the best relationships, it's a non-issue. Every single kid is meeting kind of the learner expectation of that class around participating and being prepared for class through what they're wearing, etc. So that's a really good point, Don. I think we have tended to use participation as a leverage point to get them to comply. And so we're going to take away from their grade through this. But in reality, it is much more driven through what is that environment in the classroom. Now, I want to real quick, Becky, before we move into maybe another question here. I know we're kind of getting short on time, but you mentioned other classes as well. I do think, though, that is where we really need to fully understand what is being asked of the students in some of those standards. So I do know, for example, it's very common with music standards that the language might say that they need to engage or participate in an ensemble. All right. So now the language in the standard specifically states to the fact that they need to do this collectively together in that ensemble. Then great. That is very much related to the language of the standard. But I think it's where we sometimes insert words that are not a part of that then change the entire outcome of how we approach it. So I think my advice, and it even goes back to the physical education side of it, is really, really understand and look at what is the standard asking of the student, and don't put additional layers into that don't necessarily relate to the language of the standard.
Yeah. And thank you both for that insight too. I think it just, again, just because something is rooted in tradition, or it's what we've always done, kind of going back to our first question we were talking about today, it doesn't mean it doesn't require us to step back, look at it, and think of how we can rethink things differently. So I do want to there's one more question I would love to get to. It's a relatively quick response question. So we'll grab that one before we close out for today. So I've heard, and I know both of you have heard this too before, where schools are either looking at their standards or breaking them down into their learning targets. And now we're talking about how we're going to report student learning. And we get the question, well, is it okay to weight some standards or targets more heavily than others? And a lot of times that's followed up by, because I spend 3 weeks on this standard or this target, but I only spend 1 week or 2 lessons on this target. So shouldn't the one I spend longer on weight more? And so I'd love for you guys just to chime in. Again, I know it's not a whole lot of discussion probably, but just thoughts about that. Should that be an option, not be an option? And what's the reasoning behind that?
Don, I'm going to let you take this one first. I have some pretty strong thoughts on it.
Yeah, I have 2 versions of my thoughts too. Just so I'll be curious. The first version is, okay, if we truly go through the process of prioritizing our standards, our prioritized ones are the ones that we say are the most important, that we teach, assess, reteach, reassess, reteach, reassess, reteach. That's where that 3 weeks comes in, right? And those standards, in my opinion, should have equal weight as we work through them, right? And Becky, as you gave that example, you just did the best example of the need to know versus nice to know without saying the prioritized versus the nice to know standards, right? Because that other one we just teach, but that we're not going to reteach, reassess, reteach, reassess, reteach, because we just said we don't spend 3 weeks on that. We spend 1 day. So the prioritized ones are the ones that go into our grade book. Okay. But then I would just also briefly going to say my slightly other version of that is just knowing like that's the theory. What I said first was the theory. That's the direction we're trying to go, we're working towards. But as you're on that journey, the reality may be that you're in the middle of a band-aid kind of a phase of trying to figure out how do we get there. And I don't ever want people to be completely deterred because they're still in the transition. But I think have the theory, the goal of how do we work there. But if your current system, your current grade book, your current practices don't directly align to that, just know that your long-term goal is prioritize and nice to know. The nice to know we don't put in the grade book. We're not assessing to those. We teach them. But the other ones, I'd say like just I'd say the reality might be maybe you do for now. We've seen some folks where it's like they end up chunking standards together. Like they'll put them under maybe competencies or they'll put them under some other category, which means like 3 standards go into this one, 4 standards go into this one for how they report that out. So maybe that's okay. But long term, ideally, every single standard would essentially have equal weight from my perspective. Garth, you have strong. Let's hear yours.
Yeah, and it's that because I think, and it's a good point, Don, that you bring up where there may be some transitional stages that are occurring based on what your current reality is. But I think in its truest form of what we're aiming to do is if we've done the work the right way, as Don said, and we have absolute clarity on, it's not just the clarity in what we're teaching, because I think, as Don mentioned, there's some that are going to be of higher priority. And it was the piece he said that I want you to really think about for our listeners. It's not just about teaching and assessing. It's about the need to potentially reteach and reassess if the students aren't there yet. And so I think those kind of carry a little bit more of a priority in our minds. But my worry when we start to weight standards differently, especially in the grade book, is it now moves us further away from the clarity that we're aiming to accomplish with our students. Like it becomes confusing to say, okay, well, this one is going to be weighted at this, and this one's going to be weighted down here, but I'm still assessing you on it. It's still going into your gradebook, et cetera. I guess if I'm on the mindset, if we want our students to fully understand where they are in their journey, if we want them to fully understand what's leading to the overall symbol that they're getting in that class, let's say a letter grade, then the easiest way to accomplish clarity is to have equal value. Now, where I have said to some groups in the past where the difference may lie is maybe you assess a standard or target more often. So, like it's going to be like this one, a lot of math classes are very cyclical in nature. And so, or, think about an English class or whatever it may be. This particular one, I maybe put more value on it because there's a lot to that standard. Well, great. You're going to assess it more frequently, but it's still going to carry the same weighted value in terms of what goes into that overall grade. So I think that's a way to kind of look at it too, where some are going to get more attention through just the frequency of how often they're assessed.
Yeah. So I love how you both kind of talk through like, well, if it's a priority, it's a priority. If it's supporting, it's supporting, right? So getting clear about that. But also I love that addition that you had, Garth, of like, okay, well, then we may assess it more often, but that doesn't mean that it is weighted more. And I always look at that too from the lens of like, who decides why it's weighted more? Because you thought that as a teacher? Like, what if the kids are like, well, I think the other one should be weighted more because I did better on it. I had a better understanding. Like, we can just diminish all of those conversations if we just say, all of these have equal importance for our kids to know and be able to do. That's why we went through the process of prioritization and not looking at it through that lens. But again, we have those stepping stones, and you guys both gave some really great examples of those stepping stones along the way. So we are coming up on the end of our time here today. So that concludes our questions from the field. Hopefully you were able to find some things that were relatable, or if you have deeper questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But we hope to do one of these episodes again, and do these episodes periodically. So if there are questions that you would love us to tackle, please feel free to reach out to us or message us. We are happy to add those to our list for future episodes that we have. Don and Garth, thank you so much for your expertise in our conversation this morning. Super excited to see you on our next episode where we dig into assessment. Thanks and have a great day.